Was there real reading amongst the people? There wasn't any until the printing press.
Yeah, the printing press is what democratized it, really.
You have to wonder now if that was a good idea, because obviously, the democratization of reading.
To have everyone read.
Now you got Twitter. Now look where we are.
Yeah, now look where we are.
Okay, well, where we are is moments away from another episode of Charbroiled Chats. Grace, Bob and Wally are standing by, library cards in hand, ready to talk about the art, science and technology of reading.
Nobody reads, literally. I mean, there are no books.
There are no books.
And young people especially, people under 20, have never seen a book as far as I know.
I think part of what we should reflect on and understand is reading these days doesn't mean only a book, right?
Yes, indeed.
That's true.
I grew up with books, even though we had television and radio, because those were controlled by the parents. That meant reading books, reading newspapers, which I ultimately delivered at one point.
Of course you did.
Yeah, of course.
You did.
Yeah. And so reading was allowed. It was encouraged because it's what made people smart. At least that's what my parents told me.
Right.
That's interesting.
Well, see, when you say reading, my immediate reation is it's a book.
Yeah.
I don't consider Twitter reading, you know.
Yeah.
But that's different now.
Well, I actually did a little research and I found a Pew study from 2019. It says 70% of adults in the U.S. read a book in the past year in any format.
Wow.
So what's interesting, though, is that the growth is coming from, what do you think?
I don't know.
Audiobooks. Audiobooks.
Yeah.
Those are going up. Yeah. And it said that in the survey, it said the average is 12 books a year and the median is 4 books a year. But 25% say they didn't read any books, period.
Wow.
Okay. But for our purposes, is an audiobook reading? Listening to an audiobook?
I guess it depends on if you're actually talking about the physical act of reading.
Well, that makes it really interesting. In my teaching at a local university, which will remain anonymous for its sake, I taught undergraduate and in communications, and almost all of those students were in technical majors of some sort, really geared to, and I would start every class, didn't matter what the particular course was, with the question of, what is our oldest human technology?
Oh, that's interesting.
Well, you can imagine. Guess what the answers were?
Fire.
Yeah. Fire.
Fire, yeah.
Wheels.
And so we'd have, to go around, somebody say stone, and somebody would say, inevitably, they would get to printing.
Yeah.
And then it was my turn, and I'd say, you're all wrong.
Oh.
They'd wait, and I'd say, language.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so we'd have some really fun discussions because future engineers would argue, well, wait a minute, and we'd have all this kind of argument in a good sense. Because then it went from language in the form of, like us, talking and whatever, grunting, whatever, to ideograms, to images. And the basis for that was business. The king or queen had to, keep track of all the gold or something,
Right. Mm-hmm. The pharaoh had to keep track of the grain.
So when you talk about reading now, I think, well, there was a time when you couldn't read.
Yeah.
But you could talk, but you were limited, right, to who could hear you or understand your language. Now we're beyond that. in a weird way, I think. But the technology's enabled it to be what you say. Listening to someone who had to write something.
Well, so maybe how did you define technology with them then? Like your definition of technology allowed for language. So how are you defining technology?
Well, Professor, I let them add to that too, as listen, just think of what we just said, amongst ourselves of the tool. It's a tool, right? Mm-hmm. A stone, a wheel, whatever.
Okay.
Right?
Talking doesn't require technology, right?
It requires a knowledge of the technology of the particular language. So,
okay.
We're speaking English. If you were to take that further, let's say we were all working together in a physics lab, we might be speaking in a language that sounds like English, but none of us would understand.
Right.
So that was the rationale. That's just my...
And if we were sitting in a cave and I said, look out for snake, we'd have to understand the term snake.
Yes.
And look out.
Yeah.
So that's technology.
Yeah. It's a tool to accomplish, in the snake case, avoiding having to kill your cave mate because they got bit.
Was there real reading amongst the people? There wasn't any until the printing press.
Oh, yeah, there was. But
by
you
monks
mean when you're saying among the people, do you mean among the masses?
Well, yeah, not the monks, not counting monks or
the
royals.
Yeah, the printing press is what popularized it. Not popularized it, democratized it, really.
Right.
And who invented printing?
Oh, everyone knows that, Bob. Come on.
I'm playing professor. I'm thinking, who invented printing?
Oh, okay. Well, now I'm going to say Gutenberg, and you're going to be like, nope.
Yeah, that's not right. Dumbass.
Well, it wasn't. It
wasn't.
No. Gutenberg invented the printing press. But in order to do that, there had to be a prior technology, which was movable block type.
Oh.
Which was invented by the Chinese.
Gutenberg invented movable type.
Exactly, movable, so you could use the blocks and reproduce.
Of course.
Because of the press. It was I saw a picture of it once. It was really a modified wine press.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or food press. The first one, the prototype.
Did you know that doing letterpress is very complex and you need to know math? Did you know that? I mean, it's true. Like, you have to be able to do math in your head to be able to set type quickly and...
Right.
Yeah.
The famous monks you mentioned, right? Who would be copying by hand...
Yeah. The scribes.
The same content.
Over and over. Can you imagine that?
No. And just think of that, though, in the context of later industrialization of other things, not reading, but, those pictures from the early 20s, you'd see whole warehouse size of usually women, right, typing.
Yeah.
Or doing it, right? Yep. So that was a version of those monks. We also talked about was who controlled the aspect of literacy. Mm-hmm. And therefore the masses, as we talked about, that sense of, it's tied into so much of the power of people in social sense and, social, political, economic, whatever.
Right.
But reading is so fundamental.
And this is where this topic had the potential to go right off the rails.
Uh-huh. But we won't.
Yeah.
You have to wonder now if that was a good idea. Because obviously, the democratization of reading.
To have everyone read.
Now you got Twitter. Now look where we are.
Yeah, now look where we are. Well, in my little study, does say that sales of physical books have increased every year since 2013, which I would not have guessed.
Wow.
Yeah, and it said from, let's see, what was it, up 1.3% in 2018.
Wow.
That's interesting. Like, what's driving that?
Yeah.
So people would rather listen than read? Is that what's coming out of this?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's like the way that they consume podcasts that, I would actually probably ingest, let's put it this way, I would ingest more books if I had access to more audiobooks. I don't buy them. I don't really download them. But like people use podcasts and audiobooks, I think in the same way on a commute when they're painting their living room, that's how they consume that stuff.
Right.
Because everyone wants to multitask,
What was the last book, physical, print book that you read?
Well, so does it have to be a printed paper book or can it be on Kindle?
Well, I think you had to read it. It could be Kindle, sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm reading right now. It's interesting. I'm reading this collection of Nora Ephron's old essays or long form articles. It's very interesting because it's like a history book. I mean, it's funny. I thought I would find her funnier than I do, and maybe she gets funnier as she gets older because I've never really read her. But this sounded interesting to me. She's talking about, like, she did an article on Eric Siegel, Rod McEwen, right? How many people remember those two? Interesting, because there are a lot of times you'll read essays and they'll be timeless, but this is definitely not timeless. It definitely is of its time. That's what I'm reading right now. Okay. What about you guys?
Yeah, Walt, what about you?
The last book I read The Splendid and the Vile.
What's that?
Churchill during the Blitz. You remember Churchill,
Really?
Grace.
Yeah.
We had that discussion.
I was his nanny.
Huh.
And I read, I looked at my Kindle because I probably read 95% ebooks.
Yeah, me too.
When this topic came up, I thought, well, I haven't really been reading at all. But in the past year, I read 21 books.
Yeah.
That's like every 2 weeks. That's not bad.
I was thinking the same thing. And then all of a sudden I started ticking off the stuff I've read. And it's like, yeah, I guess I have. What about you, Bob?
Oh, you really don't want to know.
No, we don't.
Yeah, we do.
No, Walt knows.
Yeah, Walt doesn't want to.
Bob read 6,000 books last year.
I have a rather, at least my wife Kate says, unusual approach to reading. Will simultaneously be reading as many as 6 to 8 books.
Wow.
And they're books. I don't read Kindle because I find, just for me personally, that the relationship I have to the printed word in the book, going back to my childhood, in fact, my eyesight, I just can't stand. I spend enough time on the computer as it is.
Yeah.
And so I'd rather, it's a break. It's a physical focusing that doesn't lead me into something else. Anyway, I tend these days to be reading a lot of history. Heather Cox Richardson's book, How the South Won the Civil War. I
just found out about her through a friend.
Oh, she's great.
Posts her stuff all the time. Yeah, she really is.
Letters from an American. I read that. I am reading a novel. I used to read a lot of novels, but I focused on nonfiction for years. This one is called This Is Happiness.
I've heard about that. Who wrote it?
Niall Williams, or Neil something. But Niall Williams, he's an Irish writer.
Right. Yep, I think I read the review of that.
It's wonderful. If ever I were to get an audiobook, it would be this one, because his voice on the page, the writer's voice, the character is telling the story of electricity coming to rural Ireland in a way that is just amazing blend of characters and stuff. I mean, it's really, it's a treat. It's a real change from how the South won the Civil War. But there's lots of part of that is because I'm also writing. So
that's good.
And why do you have to jump around like that? Why can't you just focus on one thing, Bob?
Well, no, that's a fair question.
Yeah, why can't you just focus on something?
Well, I've always had that problem.
Aha.
See, I would never do that. I'm like anal enough that I just start something and then I finish it before I go to the next
I'm the
book.
same way.
Well, because I think if I were reading a lot of fiction, for example, that it would be different. The difference may be, let me draw a comparison. Binge watching television series, right? You remember those days when you would watch a program and then you'd have to wait till next week, and then hopefully you'd be oriented to who was doing what to whom. And right. Yeah, I understand that when it comes to if you're reading a novel. But if you're reading history or political philosophy or whatever, nonfiction, at least for me, it's very easy to pick up where I left off, and I'm not...
Right. Whereas with fiction, you might cross storylines or something and be confused.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas electrification in rural Ireland and King Henry VIII are different. You're not going to confuse those.
I'll give you one I'm reading now by this historian called The War That Ended Peace. And there was lots of characters because it was the lead up to World War I. And so you've got all these...
Was Wonder Woman in it?
Not yet.
World War I has become the favorite war, though, of the 20th
I think
century.
so.
It displaced World War II.
Well, because
As the
you've got more
you've
got more characters. Queen Victoria family. It's a family feud.
Oh, is it really? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Bob, if you continue on some further episodes, you'll come to realize that history is a huge gaping hole in my knowledge base. So anything you're going to tell me about history, A, it'll be new to me, and B, I'll believe it. So
Literary history, though, you said you're okay with that.
Literary history I'm okay with, yeah.
Good.
And plague history, as a matter of fact, because I've read a couple of really good books about the plague. So
Really? Yeah. Like what? Which ones?
I'm not going to remember the names of them now, but one of them was just all about the bubonic plague and, the history of it and the manifestations of it and blah, blah, blah. And then another one was a novel, actually, of a female doctor who was practicing during the plague. Wow. So that was interesting. I wish I could remember. It was about at least 4 years ago that I read the nonfiction book. It was very interesting, though.
Was that doctor in the plague, the Spanish flu plague, or earlier?
No, it was fantasy really. So she was in the bubonic plague, the Black Death. Oh, actually, and I also, one of the professors I work with, I said, hey, can you give me a good book? When I first started in the School of Public Health, I'm like, can you give me a good book that would maybe ground me a bit? And she gave me a book about the cholera plague in London in the 1850s, which led to basically the birth of epidemiology. And that was really interesting. And,
There was a book I read a long time ago called The Big Stink.
Yeah. What was that about?
I think it was at the same time in London when they had to build the sewer system.
Yeah.
Because the cholera was so bad, and they figured out that the water had something to do with it.
It was. That was the key, that they finally figured out that there was a well that was contaminating the water that people were drinking.
So they built this huge network of underground tunnels that are still used today to transport sewage. Wow. Probably the best book on sewage I ever read.
I bet.
I can't do audiobooks because I can't focus. I just lose track, and I'm thinking about something else. And I can listen to podcasts, and there's not that problem.
But not an audiobook.
And when I have listened to podcasts, it is, in a sense, participating in a conversation.
Right. You don't really have to pay that much attention.
No, I don't know. What's your name again? But I get what you're saying, Walt.
And speaking of podcasts, if you could leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, we'd love to hear from you. Twitter, email, subscribe.
Walt's a shameless self-promoter.
That was a professional read in there, Bob.
Good for you.
Beautifully done. I mean, you just...
Yeah, good for you, Wally.
Okay.
You know what I just thought of in this, when I was growing up, and this obviously ages me, and some would argue I haven't grown up. A library card was a license to learn. And because learning was advocated and pushed in my family, first time I got that and had to walk whatever mile, more than a few miles, to the public library was an adventure. And the reason I'm thinking about that is today, with the reading electronically, reading on the phone, reading, etc., as we've been talking about it, as long as young people and kids in particular have access to that, they're reading, they're learning to read, to understand, to use the language, and probably the only difference being the technology, I guess. I don't know.
Well, here's the final data point that I have from that survey. It says adults 18 to 29 are more likely to read books than those 65 plus.
Really?
Really?
Yep. Now, I don't know if that has anything to do with, like, the college experience. I don't know if that counts or not.
Right.
Because when they did the survey, did they say books for pleasure or books for your personal use, versus like stuff that you had to read for a class? But at my last job, I worked at a software developer, so I was by far like the oldest person there. And I had a lot of buddies who were in their 20s and early 30s, and they were always reading. And in fact, they're always telling me about books to read. So I think that's interesting. There are two things that I was just thinking of, though. The whole, it's really weird. I read all the time. But I do not remember my parents ever reading to me. It's really strange. I just don't remember that at all. And so I don't know if it actually happened or not. Like with my son, I read every single night to him until he was too old to really want to do that anymore, which is maybe even like 13, because we were still doing like some of the Percy Jackson books, which is this huge series.
Is he a regular?
But I don't remember. I don't remember. He was a regular reader, but these days he's a gamer, and that's like all he does.
That's it. Well, see, that's where my "Is Reading Dead" came from. I just get that feeling that it isn't happening.
But I think he might go back to it. I really do, because he always, and this is just up until a few years ago, he used to have a book allowance. I used to give him an allowance to go to Barnes & Noble every month.
Wow.
And when we'd go on vacations, we always had to go to a bookstore, and he always had to pick up a book, And sometimes he's very design oriented, so sometimes he'd get it just because it looked good, But he usually read them.
Right.
But yeah, I don't remember my parents reading to me ever. I remember my dad telling us stories. But, we had this, well, I could go off into this. We had this pillowcase with characters on it, and we would pick a character, and he would tell us a story about that character.
Oh, great.
But that's what I remember, but not the reading part of it, even though I read constantly when I was a kid.
That sense of story and storytelling is tied to what I was saying earlier. I too grew up in that kind of environment where my family read. I was the old. I am the oldest and of a large family, and we had relatives who'd read to us. The babysitters would read to us, again because the TV was off.
Oh yeah.
But storytelling is so. I guess that's where I come back to the language piece. That even before books, even before, whatever, you can easily imagine that cave you talked about, where people sit around, and if it was only telling one another what happened during the day.
It's an amazing thing when you think about our hunger for stories. I mean, beyond reading, I mean, there's now Netflix, and why do we need all those stories? Why did we all grow up in I Love Lucy, and now we're in the habit of, we can hardly exist without, whether it's reading or watching, streaming or whatever it is. We got to have those stories.
Don't you think it's connected to some of the evolutionary stuff
Yep.
that we've talked about? Like, I don't know what the evolutionary basis for it is, but obviously there's something we're not getting that we used to do when we were cave people. And reading and storytelling is taking that place. You know what I mean?
But
I don't know what it is.
Wouldn't like one story a day be enough? Why do we?
I don't.
You go from reading the Twitter to going onto Netflix, and then you binge watch something, and then you pick up a book. And
no, you're right. And sometimes you have two devices going at the same time. Sometimes three.
And you're calling me into question for reading several books at once.
Right.
Well, those are devices. That's different. Like sometimes I'll be watching something on TV, streaming something. I'll be playing a game on my tablet, and then I'll be reading the New York Times on my phone.
Yeah. Okay. So
yeah. With me, and actually this ties into my next question. With me, so a book has to immediately grab me, or else I'm just if it, within 10 pages it does not immediately grab me, I generally don't stick with it. If it has grabbed me, then I'm going to read it all the way through. But Bob, you mentioned something about nonfiction versus fiction. That has really been interesting to me for a long time, because I can read very little fiction these days, and it's been like 15 years at least, maybe 20 years that I've been in more of the nonfiction mode. And like the fiction that I read tends to be genre stuff now, right? Versus anything that's quote unquote literary. So I don't know why that is, and that's a really interesting thing to me.
I used to read a lot more fiction. I mean, pop fiction, you name it, not just literary as such. And Kurt Vonnegut was considered, a science fiction. He's literary. Yeah. But I don't know, maybe it's something to do with a grasp, trying to have a grasp of what's really going on, or the roots of where we are, or I am as a particular individual. Or nonfiction includes how-to books,
when I was younger, like I used to love people like John Updike, and writers like that. Yeah. And now, if I read anything that I wish I had a better word for it, right? And I think I'll just call it literary fiction, right?
Sure.
I just feel like all people are writing about is divorces and dysfunctional families, and I'm just totally uninterested. Right. I feel like those are the only two stories that people are writing about anymore. Relationships and bad families, and so that's why I read all the Game of Thrones books straight through thousands of pages, right? I mean, and I read Dracula last year again, and that's the kind of stuff that I can do fiction wise. But I read this book called Nothing to See Here, and it was really well done, and really I could see why it got a lot of praise, but I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And nonfiction is what interests me now, and I don't know why.
For someone who has an MFA in writing and literature, spend most of my reading energy reading history in various forms. I'll say history or analysis or political philosophy and things like that. Philosophy. Maybe it's because where we are in our lives,
So what do you think about Wittgenstein?
Be careful, Bob. Be careful how you answer.
I just answered.
It's Dave's favorite philosopher, and also you have to be careful when Grace asks you a question like that. She's trying to trick you into mansplaining.
No tricking involved. I just
naturally do it.
Yeah, I just mansplain it. It's a good thing I'm married to Kate because she won't tolerate it.
Yeah. Wally, who's your favorite author?
Well, I've read almost all of John le Carré.
Oh, yeah.
I just like the density of the spy thing.
Are his books as dense as the movie that they made out of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy? Because that was like, you could not look away from that for 30 seconds else you were lost.
That was excellent.
Yeah. So are his books that dense?
Oh, I think more dense, than a movie.
Wow.
I don't know. I really get lost in those. And I just read the book that I think I enjoyed more than any other book I ever read, News of the World.
Who's that?
By Paulette Giles, News of the World. It's a cowboy story.
I don't know it.
Set in Texas and after the Civil War, but I was just totally blown away by it.
Maybe I'll have to pick that up.
All her books, I read 4 of them this year. They're excellent. Paulette Giles.
Oh, is that the one where he's with the young girl?
Yep.
Okay. Because I've heard about the movie.
Yeah.
But not the
the
book.
Movie got mixed reviews, but the book is excellent.
Well, that's interesting.
What about the idea that we don't need little symbols on a piece of paper anymore? That we have video now, we have audio, we can, people learn everything on YouTube.
I think different people have different ways of learning. I love movies, that, I'm a totally visual person. But when I have to learn something, it's much easier for me to learn it via reading than it is via a YouTube tutorial.
Yeah, me too. Well, it sounds...
Even building a PC? Or...
Well, with the PC, it did help to have the videos, no doubt.
Yeah.
You're right.
If you think about something like that and just transfer it to text, page after page, you wouldn't figure it out ever,
Yeah, no, you're right about that.
We are in a visual culture. And I agree with you, Grace. I think we have different learning styles or preferences. But to your question, Walt, why do you read is the question. I'd agree with you on some of the stuff. A lot of the technology I've used in my work over my careers, I'd learned by doing it.
Yeah.
I agree. And not by reading a manual.
But even with fiction, Netflix is a better way to deliver fiction than.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that. I mean, I'm thinking about I'm putting aside like how-tos, right? Because I totally take your point.
Right.
But when I'm reading a book, if it's nonfiction or fiction, I'm just totally immersed in it. And anyone who is close to me knows that you cannot really talk to me when I'm reading because I will not hear you. It's this totally immersive thing for me, and there's nothing else that gives me that feeling. And it's definitely not even like a movie.
Uh-huh.
And I love movies.
But maybe you're a word lover and you grew up reading, and for the rest of the world,
Interesting.
you're in the minority.
Wow.
I'm just suggesting that maybe we're done with reading. We can just move on and forget that awkward making a symbol, making it mean something, putting it on paper, absorbing it. Just a thought.
Well, that people say that like in text messages, soon we're not going to even need words. It just will be totally emojis.
Right. I looked up why do we read on Google, and it sent me to the Toledo Public Library, 5 reasons you should read every day. And I clicked on that, and it was a video.
No, it was not.
Yes, it was.
I love it.
So there you go. My point is proven.
I thought you were going to say it was a broken link.
I rest my case.
That's interesting.
No, I think it is. I think you're onto something, Walt, with that the media technology, pre-electronic, if you will, reading, in some ways still is. But now, gamer is something you mentioned earlier about your son, Grace. Yeah, my son is into that too, in a way that is participating in that kind of activity. And I got that from reading when I was young, and still do. That it's me and this thing I'm learning, this idea. But I don't need to have it be only in reading, obviously. But interesting, Walt. I think you're onto something.
Well, it's strange because, there are some movies that I see that I think, oh my God, I wish this were 8 hours long, because I suspect it would be more like reading to me then, because that's one thing I love about a book, especially a really long book, is like you're engaged in it for so long, and it is so pleasurable to have that,
Right.
And like when we saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there was like the short version, and then there was like one that was 10 minutes longer, so it was, 2:45 or something, and I was like, I want this to be 8 hours long.
Wow. Well, maybe there's something there too. I know there's research. There's one of the books I have is called Blur. Another one is called The Coders, Coders. That talks about the attention span or the focus necessary to do whatever. So you imagine what it would be like to be to the language of coding, to create these games, to do some of the digital technology experiences that we have, those languages, and the impact that attention span. The way you described it, Grace, of being able to get immersed in a book, like Game of Thrones or whatever, over time, is no different if you want to look people.
No, you're right.
I mean, that's it.
It's not. And I think maybe part of it is, I don't know if it's the way you learn or just the way your brain works, but I have an ability to definitely, like I'm really good at meditation. Like I can immediately just go to this like place where I can empty my mind out, and I can focus on things very, very, closely and for long periods of time. And so maybe, there are people that have less focused attention spans, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, but, that maybe that's a function, maybe that's part of whether you really like to read or not.
There's a theme here. There's an element of all of it to the reading. It's curiosity. You can pique my curiosity and hold it. You said something earlier about that, Grace. If the book, the story, I find this in following the news. I look at it, I got it. First paragraph, next.
Yeah.
That's it. It's like, oh, tell me more. I want to know more.
I think you're right about that, because I did some career counseling once, and the most interesting thing I found out, there was this matrix that you did. You came up with your 20 top values at work, right? And you put them down the x-axis and across the y, well, down the x side and across the top, right? Top 5 values at work. And so 2 through 5, I could have easily told you, like creativity, control, I can't remember the other 2. But number 1, I would never have guessed is learning.
Yeah.
So and that's what always keeps me engaged on a job. I have to be learning.
Right.
So the button then, Walt, is, are you still saying that reading is dead? Do you believe that? Is it dead and or dying?
I believe it's dying among some populations. I think the button, Grace, is that I wanted to bring this up on a previous podcast. You started talking about a story, The Jilting of Granny Weatherall.
Oh, yeah.
And I cut you off because we were going long.
Yeah.
And I had some comments that I was kind of rude the way so if you'd like to just go ahead and talk about The Jilting of Granny Weatherall.
Are you kidding?
No.
Oh.
No, you wanted to bring that up before, so.
Did I? I don't remember the context, though, necessarily. Oh, my gosh. Dang.
Is that a book you're reading?
Well,
or read?
It was something I read in high school, and then I read later on, too. And then I think when I was a teaching assistant, I think I included it in my syllabus.
I think we're out of time now, and we can just go on.
You set me up.
That was a long setup. Grace, Bob, and Wally has been kind of successful. It has a ring to it, too.
Bob and Wally's Burgers.
It sounds like an Australian shorebird.
Something like that.
Grace, Bob, and Wally could be your pen name.
Oh.
Yeah.
Tales of the Australian
Outback. Oh, my God. Okay, should we stop recording now?
Yes, stop recording. But please don't stop listening to Charbroiled Chats, because I have a feeling we haven't heard the last of Granny Weatherall. Meanwhile, tweet us at @charbroiledc or email us at charbroiledchats@gmail.com. Also, if you take a minute to hop on over to iTunes or YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts and write a review of Charbroiled Chats, we would really appreciate it. Subscribe, like, follow, comment, and most of all, tell your friends about Charbroiled Chats. See you next time.
I just have one more thing to say.
Okay.
Oh, boy.
All right. You're going to mansplain something, are you?
Back in the day, many years ago, Bob and Wally was my gay porn name.
It wasn't Mike Hondo?
Yeah, we can stop recording, I think.
Jeez.